I have so many questions I want to ask you. Why don't we start with just your definition of what you're talking about when you mean childhood conditions, so that as the person is listening to us today and spending time with us together, we're all using the same words and concepts and we kind of start on the same page.
So child conditions include the physical conditions, nutrition, housing, um, comfort, protection, but they also include the emotional conditions, which it has to do with a child's sense of being accepted or being loved, or not just as loved, but actually being seen, understood, and also on the parents' emotional states. Are the parents stressed? Are the parents struggling with economic difficulties? Are the parents carrying traumas that they hadn't worked through yet, like I had when I was a young parent? Um, are the parents in a marriage that's relatively peaceful, or is there a lot of conflict? Is there a lot of instability? Is there unpredictability? What kind of community support there is? Is there an extended family that can spell off the parents and give them some kind of emotional support? Are they rather isolated? Are you a single parent struggling to make a living and raise a child? So all these conditions affect the personality and the brain development of the child.
I know you wrote the original book on childhood development and ADHD,
Yeah,
Scattered Minds,
yeah,
25 years ago. It is
yeah,
still on the bestseller list when it comes to ADHD topics.
yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to say this correctly, but is it fair to say that your opinion is that your childhood and the conditions and the experiences that you have directly create or cause ADHD, addiction, and autoimmune issues?
Yes, along with certain genetic predispositions.
Okay.
But I can talk about genetics later, but what I want to say about them now is a predisposition is not as same as a predetermination.
Okay.
So you can have predispositions, but then depending on the environmental conditions, those predispositions can be expressed one way or another way. So you can have animals with the same genes or humans with the same genes. They'll have very different outcomes depending on the kind of conditions under which the early years were spent under. So that's what I'm saying, yes. And the first recognition of that in my life came when I was diagnosed with ADHD at age 53 or 52 or something.
So I was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 46
Okay?
when our son, Oakley, was going through the process
Yeah,
of going through neuropsych evaluations for schools and IEPs. And
yeah,
as they were doing his evaluations, I started going, oh, wait a minute. That's a lot like me.
yeah,
And then I went through the formal process of being evaluated and diagnosed dyslexia, ADHD.
yeah.
And I had never, ever, ever heard anyone connect your childhood and adverse conditions or conditions where you didn't get your needs met
Yeah.
being a contributing factor or a cause of ADHD. How is that even possible?
Well, it's possible because Western medicine separates the mind from the body.
Hmm.
So they tend to look at things purely from a biological point of view. So ADHD is considered to be a genetic disease that you inherited. Here's the problem with that. Number one, if that's the case, why are the numbers going up? Genes don't change in a population over 10, 20, or 30 years. So something's going on in the environment that's affecting the child development. Number one. Number two, even if you look at the physiology of the child's brain, was not understood by most physicians because it's not taught in the medical schools, but is firmly and completely, unequivocally, and uncontroversially established in brain science, is that the brain is a social product, that the brain development of the child depends on the emotional conditions under which the child lives from in utero onwards. And so that the very circuitry of the child's brain, it's programmed by the action of the environment on the genes. So different environments will act differently on the same genes. Now, if you look at ADHD,
Yes.
what's the medication that we give? I took it for a while. Stimulants.
Yeah.
What do stimulants do? They elevate the level of a chemical called dopamine in the brain. And dopamine is essential for motivation and therefore for focus. And that's what Ritalin and Dexedrine and Adderall and all these medications elevate. Now, The dopamine circuitry of the child's brain develops in interaction with the environment. And this is what most people who deal with ADHD just don't look at, even though it's just a pure scientific fact, and a summary from Harvard University pointed out that the child's brain develops in interaction with the environment, especially the emotional relationship with the nurturing adults. Now, dopamine is a brain chemical. We have receptors for it in our brain, and receptors are molecules where the dopamine can land and do its job. The number of dopamine receptors in a child is affected by stress on the mother already in pregnancy, let alone afterwards. If you take mice and you isolate them, the number of dopamine receptors will go down. If you bring them back into companionship, the number of dopamine receptors will elevate. In other words, the brain is a social organ. It's interactive with the environment all our lives, and therefore environmental conditions affect the brain, especially during its phase of early development. It's just pure science. It's not even controversial. So the problem here is the tendency of the medical profession in which I was trained is to separate the mind from the body and to look at brain biology in isolation from the life
Mm.
circumstances that shape that brain biology. So that's one problem here.
So I'm going to try to distill what you just said because I've never heard it explained quite like that. And I believe you.
Mm.
What you're saying is that your brain is a social organ
That's right.
that is developed in partnership with your relationship to the adults around you
Exactly.
when you're literally inside your mother's womb
Yeah.
all the way until you are, developing as a little kid.
Yeah.
And if you are in a condition, whether it is the condition of being inside your mother's womb and your mother is depressed or
Yeah.
experiencing racism or abuse
Yeah.
or poverty or any of these things that create chronic stress on a human being, it impacts the development of your brain.
Exactly.
And what you're also saying is that ADHD and the way that it is treated is typically through prescription drugs
That's right.
that flood the brain with dopamine.
Yeah.
And that is what helps your underdeveloped brain, or whatever we want to
Yeah.
call it,
Yeah.
or the brain that's been impacted by
Yeah.
stressful conditions during your childhood or your development
Yeah.
in womb. And that the stressful conditions are what has interfered with the brain development.
And continues to. Now,
Can I ask you a quick question?
yeah.
So I understand that when, as a human being, you're experiencing stress,
Yeah.
or you are experiencing a threat,
Yeah.
or you're feeling isolated and lonely and
Yeah.
like you're invisible or
Yeah.
nobody cares about you,
Yeah.
that it switches between that your body naturally switches from being present and in the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala taking over, and you're now in like fight or flight. When you're in fight or flight and you're kind of in that stress response state, does it interfere with dopamine?
It interferes with dopamine, it interferes with cortisol. It has effect on the memory centers in the brain, like the hippocampus. It affects the amygdala, all those things. And if you look at children in poverty or who experience racialized circumstances, they're more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. The children of women with postpartum depression are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. The children of women who are stressed during pregnancy are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. And there's this myth about it being genetic because it tends to run in families. Like you were diagnosed, your kids were diagnosed. I was diagnosed, a couple of my kids were diagnosed. But it's not because the so-called disease, first of all, it's not even a disease, but it's not because the so-called disease was passed on, but because the conditions that created
the brain.
that created your brain were also then repeated in your children's childhood as in mine. So something running in a family says nothing about genetic causation. And going back to the flight or fight thing, if a child is feeling stressed, and by the way, I think there's something genetic here, and what is genetic here is sensitivity. And the more sensitive kids are, the more they feel what's going on around them. So if the parents are stressed, the child feels the stress. Can the child escape or fight back?
No.
What do? They tune out. But when did they tune out? They tune out when their brain is developing. So that gets wired into the brain. And now they're told you got this genetic disease. No, you don't. It's an adaptation that it began as an adaptation. And as with many of these childhood adaptations, later on they create problems. So they serve their purpose, but now they are wired in. And, not to mention, if you look at the traits of ADHD, which is the absent-mindedness, the tuning out, and then the other traits of ADHD are poor impulse regulation, which means that when you want to do something, like I might have an impulse to do something, there's nothing wrong with the impulse, but there's something wrong with me acting out the impulse.
Hmm.
But impulse regulation depends on certain circuitry in the brain. No baby has any impulse regulation. It has to develop. For anything that's developmental, the conditions have to be right. If a plant in your backyard wasn't growing the way you expected it, you'd look at what's missing here. Nutrition, sunlight, irrigation. It's the same with kids. When they've got these challenges, let's look at the conditions that shape their development. So impulse regulation is another brain circuitry that doesn't develop well in people with ADHD, and incidentally, in people who are addicted, which is why there's such a great link between addictions and ADHD. And then the third one is, which is sometimes there, not always, hyperactivity.
Yeah.
More tends to be there more in boys.
Boys,
Yeah.
not girls. Yep.
And regulation of the body is a function of the midfrontal cortex. That has to develop. So under conditions of stress, given that the brain is a social organ and it's also a historical organ, do you know that, does the name Bruce Perry mean anything to you?
Is he in Wisconsin?
I don't know where he is, but he's a well-known child trauma
Yes,
psychiatrist.
I believe he's in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I think, but don't quote me on that. Did he write the book with Oprah Winfrey?
Yeah, he wrote the book,
Yes, okay.
What Happened to You? And he says the brain is a historical organ. So it stores the impacts of life experiences. So when we look at brain biology, let's not think that the biology is somehow distinct and separated from life experience. So there's no fault laying here. And sometimes I do get accused of blaming parents. It's the last thing I want to do.
I don't hear you blaming parents. I
I
hear
know
you
you don't,
talking very
but
factually.
no, but there's a very well-known ADHD psychologist who goes on YouTube and says I blame parents, and I don't. Actually, I think parents do their best. They love their kids, but their best is limited by their own particular
Of course.
challenges and limitations. There's no parent blaming here, but we have to recognize the importance and impact of early experiences. So what I'm saying is that ADHD is a result of all that stress and its impact on the brains of especially genetically sensitive kids. That's what's inherited is the sensitivity. But if there was only the sensitivity and optimal conditions, they'd never have ADHD.
Is it fair to say that your childhood and the conditions and the experiences that you have directly create or cause ADHD, addiction, and autoimmune issues?
That's right. If you look at children in poverty or who experience racialized circumstances, they're more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD.